No one likes losing, and in tomorrow's elections, the Prime Minister's party is going to lose a lot. Over the next few weeks, Starmer and his allies will say that it wasn't his fault, or that even if it was, replacing him would just make it worse. But ultimately, he's not going to try and convince you that he actually won those elections. He and most other politicians don't think that we're that stupid. But what if a politician thought that you were?
So the Gordon Denton by-election is a victory. It's a victory for cheating.
There were 9,000 postal votes in Gordon and Denton. This is, in a way, the most corrupt by-election in modern British history.
When Reform lost Gordon and Denton a couple of months ago, it wasn't because of their uncharismatic candidate or their terrible campaign, but because, obviously, the election was rigged. Initially, the media blared out the seemingly credible accusations of family voting. A month later, when the police report concluded that there was no evidence of family voting, the media cycle had moved on. Even if you follow British politics pretty closely, there's a good chance you're hearing about that fact for the first time now. Farage declared the investigation a, quote, establishment whitewash, so that his remaining devotees following the story would know to reject it. The fact that believing in Farage's theory also meant believing that a Labour-controlled authority were covering up fraud for the party that they had lost to didn't really factor in. But the other thing you probably missed was just how long he's been saying this. Farage has been claiming voter fraud in response to lost elections for 12 years. Each time his accusations were thrown out for lack of evidence. But maybe next time will be different. Fifth time lucky, as the saying goes. This is the story of Farage's history of claiming voter fraud, but it's also about something more fundamental. Why does he do this? And what does a major party claiming voter fraud whenever it loses mean for British democracy? It's 2014, and UKIP, once a fringe political party, have skyrocketed in opinion polls from 2% to almost 20%. However, with UKIP's vote so widely spread, even winning seats in the next election doesn't look very likely. And so in May 2014, Farage told his supporters what to expect.
There is postal voting fraud going on a third world scale in this country. And that's
you are sure of that?
I know it.
Farage.
I know it.
When the general election came in 2015, many supporters claimed that Farage had won the election in South Thanet, circulating the hashtag #ThanetRigged, and successfully triggering an investigation by the Kent police following complaints from non-constituents. Farage himself never openly acknowledged these claims of fraud. That would change 6 months later. The electoral process is now dead, Farage told listeners on Radio 4 after losing the Oldham West and Royton by-election. To most people brainwashed by the establishment, the result was basically identical to the general election earlier that year. In fact, UKIP actually went up a few percent. But Farage knew differently. UKIP's loss, he said, was due to abuses and big ethnic changes in the way that people are voting, due to the state of modern Britain post-mass immigration. In that by-election, Farage's evidence of fraud would progress beyond, quote, I know it, to claiming to have received, quote, evidence from an impeccable source. Unfortunately, Farage did not publicly disclose this impeccable source, and UKIP's formal request for a police investigation failed. Even some figures within the party began to see Farage's claims of voter fraud as bad for their reputation. UKIP Deputy Chairman Suzanne Evans said that the claims made the party look like bad losers. By the summer of 2019, Farage looked closer to power than ever. With the popularity of mainstream parties collapsing, Farage's new Brexit party polled 6% ahead the next largest one. With a by-election in heavily Brexit-voting Peterborough that June, his chance to gain an MP and prove his party as a real electoral force was finally here, with the media generally expecting a decisive Reform victory.
But in some ways what happens here on Thursday is even bigger. It really is, it's even bigger.
And then the result came.
So congratulations on the battle that your party fought, but I'd imagine that as close as it was, there must be a tinge of disappointment that you didn't quite get over the line.
Farage would find an excuse once again. Peterborough was a, quote, rotten borough. A Brexit Party spokesman was more explicit as to his concerns with the Pakistani vote. Right-wing columnist Rod Liddell summed up the thinking of those inside the Brexit Party ecosystem well in an editorial for the Sunday Times. My suspicion is that quite a few of those who voted in Peterborough with help from community leaders may have been people who do not speak English and may well have thought that they were ticking a box to choose their favourite vegetable side dish. Tarka dal, brinjal bhaji, or Bombay aloo. I suppose this last comment will be considered a racist aside, he noted quite perceptively. At this point, it's probably worth noting that every single claim of voter fraud made by Farage was eventually thrown out for lack of evidence. In fact, not only are instances of voter fraud negligible with mail-in ballots, but they tend to help older voters who are more likely to vote reform. In the 2024 election, Farage toned down his rhetoric, but still claimed that there was, quote, corruption in our postal vote system and many other things. In that interview, he echoed claims that Biden had only won the 2020 election due to alleged vote harvesting. On this, it feels pretty difficult to ignore the parallels between Trump and Farage. Trump, like his British equivalent, has a long history of claiming voter fraud in the face of election loss. These claims, echoed by a compliant media, would eventually result in the events of January 6th. Whilst his attempts to overthrow the 2020 election have gone pretty badly, he still hasn't let up.
The Republicans should say, we want to take over, we should take over the voting in at least 15 places. The Republicans ought to nationalize the voting.
Officially, to stop fraud, Trump has called for the nationalization of federal elections.
Damn right. We're going to have ICE surround the polls come November. We're not going to sit here and allow you to steal the country again.
Over the last few years, reform-aligned media has been starting its own rhetoric of stopping the steal.
But there's a problem with our democracy. It's bent, it's crooked, it doesn't work. I've argued for 20 years that our postal vote system is massively open to fraud, abuse. I've even fought court cases on it. I remember in the Peterborough by-election, going back to 2019, someone turning up in a polling station with 1,000 ballot papers in a supermarket carrier bag, and yet they were all accepted. Well,
for 300 years, the British people have taken a great deal of pride in being too cynical to fall for the authoritarian despots that our neighbours did. Why is the goose step not used in England? George Orwell once wrote on the refusal of British fascists to copy the technique from Germany. It is not used because the people in the streets would laugh. The reason Farage's stop the steal tactics are so insidious is because they rely on that democratic impulse. It relies on British cynicism, as long as that cynicism isn't extended to the good people of GB News. For Reform UK, any future loss can be pinned on a rigged election. In America, we still haven't seen the end result of Trump's stop the steal rhetoric. And in Britain, we may only be seeing the beginning of how far reform can take this.